It's great to welcome to the program today Krystal, who's a journalist, pundit, co-host of The Hill's Rising, and also author of the book The Populist Guide to 2020, A New Right and New Left Are Rising. Great to have you on, Krystal.
Thank you so much for having me, David. I really appreciate it.
So to start with, we hear from Steve Bannon all about Donald Trump's populism. And of course, that version of populism is very different than what we see espoused by people like Bernie Sanders. It's very different from what we saw in Tahrir Square, Occupy Wall Street, and so on and so forth. How would you kind of characterize the main differences between right populism and left populism?
It's such a good question, such an important question, and one that we do try to grapple with some in the book. And I mean, just to give a little bit of context here, and your viewers probably know some of this, but on our show Rising, I'm the left populist host, and my co-host Sagar is the right populist host. And we have many disagreements about how politics should be prosecuted here and around the world. But what we try to do in the book is explore the idea of what politics could look like in the future if, instead of having the situation that I believe we have now, where both political parties essentially fight for the needs of the rich, and that comes with a certain bipartisan consensus. You know, I think it's a myth that there's just gridlock in Washington. In fact, there's quite a lot of consensus around the war machine. There's been a lot of consensus around trade deals. There's been a lot of consensus around cutting taxes for corporations and creating loopholes that allow corporations to get away with paying less in taxes. We just saw, a day after impeachment, Democrats partner with Trump to pass his new trade deal, right? So there has been a lot of bipartisan consensus. Where would be the overlap and where would be the difference if you had, a Steve Bannon sort of right-wing party and a Bernie Sanders left-wing party that were both, at least in rhetoric, trying to fight to win over the working class of America? So that being said, look, my politics on the left are very much of the view that we need to put the working class, not just here, but around the world, at the center of our politics and really fight for their interests, not just try to appeal to racial anxiety in a cheap way that I think we've seen by the right in this country, certainly Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, et cetera, and that we see around the world as well. Now, the great thing about Sagar, and for those who have watched the show, you know this, he comes at these things from a very genuine perspective of he really believes that immigration restrictionism is going to be better for working class people here. He really believes in this nationalist view that says basically we have to take care of our people first. That's primary. And then after we do that, we can look around the world. Whereas I see much more of an importance between solidarity of working class peoples around the globe. So that's kind of the essential difference between the two of us. He, as you know, is critical of Donald Trump on many things, critical of the Bannon view on many things. But he comes at this from a sort of genuine and non-racist place, which, can be unusual in certain circles in the right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. One interesting academic who studies populism is Federico Finkelstein at the New School in New York City. And he's talked a lot about how, in a sense, neoliberal globalization and the anxieties it produces, either consciously or subconsciously, are responsible for a lot of the rise in both left and right-wing populism in the United States and around the world. The difference is that on the right, a lot of it becomes cultural anxiety, the anxiety about losing what some consider to be a privileged status in society. And then that leads to a sort of politics more based out of fear in right-wing populism, which is where you get the nationalist stuff and you get the, populism for the people that we define to be inside of our circle, not so much for the people outside of it, which is in a sense what you're kind of alluding to as well. On the left,
you also see, if I can just echo that,
yeah,
you also see a pairing of that, use of like white racial anxiety with a fundamentally corporatist view. So that's what I've seen in the Trump administration. They throw these bones of sort of identity politics, racial anxiety politics to the white working class base. Meanwhile, It's the same Paul Ryan corporatist agenda of making sure Amazon can get away with not paying any taxes that we've seen for decades. So there's a lack of genuine care and concern for the working class. I mean, the latest Trump budget has him cutting entitlements, right? That's what he's advocating for, something that he explicitly said he would not do in his campaign. And that is not just here. That's something that commonly unfolds around the globe as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen those right-wing populist ideas. I mean, certainly Trump, Nigel Farage in the UK, Modi of India, you could make an argument there's elements of that, even Erdogan in Turkey. It feels to me a populism of us together against them, right? Versus what you talked about in terms of inclusion of more, the concept of us against them is flawed. It's about all of us together. And that's kind of
Right.
how I would summarize it at the top level, in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, I think neoliberalism is kind of the mirror image of that. You have a selling out of the diverse working class base of the party on economic issues, and the way they keep them in the tent is just basically being like, well, at least we're not racist like the GOP. So it's a pretty, and that's effective because, yeah, you don't want to vote for a party that has contempt for you. So of course you stay in the tent, but actually trying to deliver an economic populist message that would cut across all racial and gender lines and appeal to the broad working class in America. Democratic Party hasn't been doing that for a long time. And so in the book, what we try to do, and David, you get this because we watched like CNN and MSNBC and how they get literally everything wrong. Like even after 2016, you would have thought there would have been some soul searching or like, what are we not understanding about the American electorate at this point? But no, they haven't done any of that. And so if they had been correct right now, Kamala and Beto would be battling it out for the nomination, right? Bernie Sanders was supposed to be yesterday. They still don't believe that he could be the nominee when obviously he is the frontrunner. He has the clearest shot at becoming the Democratic nominee. So what our thesis is, which I suspect you'll agree with, is you can't understand politics today and understand the rise of Trump and understand the rise of Bernie and AOC and the new left in the country if you don't grapple with the core rot in America. Why is it that the top line numbers, the GDP and the stock market is so good, and yet you have people literally killing themselves at record and historic rates? Like, what went wrong there? And if you don't understand that anger and the way that drives our politics, you're going to be completely confused by everything that you see unfolding in our politics right now.
So let's talk a little bit about the Bernie Trump thing. So there are some who say, and this is not my view, but I want to explore it with you, that the sort of crossover appeal from a Bernie supporter to Trump or vice versa is significant. Let's call it non-zero to some degree. And one of the facts that some try to cite is, look at how many Bernie primary voters in 2016 ultimately voted for Trump. Now, I don't think that's a very good argument because not that many did. I mean, if you look at, I think it was about 1 in 10 Bernie primary voters voted Trump. And if you look at 2008, you had a higher share of Hillary primary voters who voted McCain. So like, I don't believe that the mathematical argument is a good one. But the philosophical argument about, even though it seems as though Bernie and Trump are so different, that there is something of a crossover appeal. How valid do you think that assessment is?
Look, I always get nervous about this because they are very different politicians with very different views, approaches, values, all of those things. Where I see most of the parallels, and look, we can point to the obvious policy things, right? On trade, there are a lot of similarities. On at least some of the stances Donald Trump claimed to hold in that race against Hillary Clinton, even on healthcare. I mean, he basically supported a single payer system in that race. He backed lifting the minimum wage. He said he would never cut entitlements. Like, there were some parallels there, although I think those were more rhetorical than, actually the way that he's governed.
Well, that's the thing, just to explore that a tiny bit more, not to interrupt, but
sure.
Trump was so obviously pandering and lying when he said those things. Should we even consider them agreements when they were so transparently untrue?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
But, on trade, I think there are actually a lot of, that's the one area where he has been more or less, consistent with the way that he ran. And there are parallels there. But I
Yeah.
don't even think that that's really the most important thing. I think the more important parallel is the anti-establishment dynamic. And look, there are lots of things to criticize Donald Trump about, Lord knows, and I've criticized him on plenty of them. But there's also been attempts to just completely smear everyone who voted for him as racist or sexist, et cetera, and dismiss the entire movement and condemn every person who would ever support him in that way that we see basically playing out right now with the whole Bernie bro narrative that, oh, you have to be toxic or problematic to support Bernie Sanders. I do think that the media, look, I hate to stick up for him, but I do think the media has been unfair in the fact that every single story on CNN and MSNBC has to have a Trump is bad angle, which is just, it becomes caricature, right? Not every last thing that the man does is bad. A lot of it is, but not everything is. And also not every story is about him. So like I covered the teachers movement extensively, which was incredibly significant, largest sort of labor uprising that we've had certainly in my lifetime. And it got so little play on these networks that claim to care about these working class values because it didn't have a tidy Trump angle. So there's also just this, incredible inability to understand why anyone would genuinely support him for non-racist or sexist or nefarious reasons that I see paralleled with Bernie Sanders. So, for example, you have Chuck Todd just recently equating Sanders supporters to brown shirts, like the supporters of the guy who could be the first Jewish president who lost relatives in the Holocaust are compared to brown shirts, something that the ADL condemned him for. It's hard not to see a similar sort of smearing of Trump supporters as well.
No doubt about it. And I think where the rubber sort of ultimately meets the road on the sort of non-Trump stories is that it's not only that there's not a tidy Trump angle sometimes, but in general, stories that don't have like a coherent beginning, middle, and end, where you said this is the start and the story has now ended. Those stories get less coverage. And that's why the judges issue, which I've been talking about, which is, of course, I mean, these are people that are being selected by Trump, but whoever is the Republican president would be selecting similar judges, are coming by and being approved by the Senate, confirmed by the Senate, and there's barely any coverage of it. It's not really a Trump story, but it's a story that will affect the country for decades.
And it's exactly right. My children and their children will be dealing with the fallout of that development. There's also a reluctance to cover stories in which Democrats are also complicit. Right. So, war making, right. The fact that the Democratic establishment basically gave him a blank check, just as they have for every president since 9/11, to do whatever he wants overseas. That doesn't get nearly as much energy, even though, in my view, it's much more dangerous to the American public and to world stability than even, what he did in Ukraine, which wasn't okay. It wasn't acceptable. But there's so much more heat and obsession around that than the fact that he, almost stumbled us into war with Iran, which would have massive implications for decades to come. Those things are not covered on an equal basis at all because there's so much Democratic complicity in the latter.
We've been speaking with Krystal Ball, journalist, pundit, co-host of The Hills Rising, and also co-author of the book, The Populist Guide to 2020, A New Right and New Left Are Rising. Krystal, really appreciate your time.
Great being with you, David. Thank you so much.